You also might need to give me screen sharing privileges.
Are you able to share slides now? Emily, are you able to share your slides?
Yes, let me give it a try right now.
Okay.
Sorry about that. My internet cut out for a second. All right. Can you see the slides? Awesome. All right, great. I'll jump into it. And like I said, I'll just try and move through this pretty quickly so that, y'all can get a chance to ask me some questions at the end. So first about sort of how we actually measure that impact. I'll be talking a little bit about how we actually find and choose the voters that we target. I know this is a question a lot of people often have. And I'll talk a little bit about messaging as well. And again, just to introduce myself, I'm Emily. I'm the Senior Data and Research Director. I'm also based here in California. I'm up on the Central Coast. This is a nice photo of me in Death Valley. So always great to connect with fellow California folks. So Vote Forward Labs is what we call our overall program to discover new tactics and measure the impact of our programs. So for example, if you see that a campaign is a Vote Forward Labs campaign, that means it's an experimental campaign. That's something where we're trying out something new. And as I'll explain in a second, that's something where we're going to be measuring the impact of that campaign to improve our program going forward. And I like to open with this because I think that this is something that we think makes us stand out. We're always trying to improve things. We're always trying to iterate. We're always trying to just experiment with different things. And every time we do that, we are trying to also measure how well those things work in a quantitative and rigorous way so that we can come back and tell you, yeah, yes, this worked, this didn't work so well. So when we do these experimental campaigns, we let folks know via the Vote Forward Labs emailing list. So if you go to your Vote Forward profile, you don't have to do it right now, and I'll share this later. But if you go to your Vote Forward profile, there's a little toggle where you can join the labs list. And that is the best way to get on, and then you'll be notified about all the different experimental campaigns that we do. So with that Vote Forward Labs campaign, which includes also both those smaller experimental letter programs and big programs like the Big Send that we did in 2020 and the Big Send that we're doing again here in 2022, we run them as randomized controlled trials so we can measure the impact. And I'm going to talk in a couple minutes about what that means. So if you're like, that's not my wheelhouse, totally fine, we're going to get to it. But just to start off from the top, what's exciting about this tactic is that regardless of what election we're looking at, even though the numbers themselves differ, and I'll talk a little bit about that too, what we see is a consistent pattern of Vote Forward letters working. So Vote Forward letters focused on turnout do reliably cause voters to turn out at higher rates, which is really exciting. And as I said, it differs from election to election, so that specific number will differ. But the thing that we look at is that pattern over time. But you're probably wondering, how do you actually get those numbers? How do you measure that impact? We do something called a randomized controlled trial, and I'm going to walk through just at a high level what that looks like. But the basic idea is that we're going to want to compare voter turnout across voters who are similar to each other in basically every way we can measure, except that some of them are going to get Vote Forward letters and some of them don't. That means that we have people who are receiving that impact of the letters and people that aren't receiving anything. And when we compare those groups, then we can get an estimate of what that impact actually was. What's nice is that voter data is actually hard data, it's public data. And so there's no, we're not surveying people. This is real data that's coming from secretaries of state that says these exact voters turned out to vote in this election. And when we receive that data, that's when we get to measure the impact. So just for a little walkthrough, since I know that it's kind of a jargony term, right, RCT, and if you don't do this for a living, you're probably thinking like, what? But here's what it looks like in a breakdown. So controlled just means that we're going to pick some voters out of our group of voters that aren't going to get any letters. That's the first thing. And then secondly, we're going to do that in a randomized way. So you see on the right here, we have these voters that are registered voters that we want to contact for an election. We're going to essentially roll some dice using the computer, and we're going to put some of those people randomly into the control group. So those people are just going to be set aside. We're not going to do anything with them. The other people we're going to put into our system, and those are the people that you see on our website that you can write letters to. So they're going to get a letter. So what that means, because we assigned those groups randomly, is that those groups are similar to each other. We would expect that when we look at those groups, it's not, for example, the case that one of them is 80% women and the other is 20% women. We would expect those sorts of things to be basically the same across the two groups. And so what that means is that after the election, when we look at voter turnout, if there's any differences in voter turnout, we can be pretty sure that it's because of what we did. So in this example here, this is a toy example. We would never see a 20-point impact. That's insane. But let's say that in the control group, 40% turned out to vote, and in the treatment group, 60% turned out to vote. There's a 20-point gap there. And what that means is that we can be pretty sure, okay, we caused them to turn out at a rate that was 20 points higher. So getting into that impact number a little bit, it's not a raw difference. What am I trying to say? It's an average estimated effect that comes out of a statistical model. And I'm not going to bore you with the details of that, but like definitely if you want to nerd out with me, ask me about it. I'd love to talk to you about it. But we get this effect out of our statistical model that represents that best guess at the overall impact of our letters on voter turnout. So then you'll see something that looks like this bar graph. This comes from the Vote Forward Labs website, voteforward.org/labs. So if you go there, you'll see this. And that'll show the difference, again, that percentage point difference, the impact score between the control group and the treatment group. So we'll say, we said it was 20 points before. This is more realistic. We might see something in the range of like 1 to 2 points. And I know that that number, when it's framed as a percentage point number, might seem pretty small. And you might be thinking like, okay, why should we care? But I do want to emphasize that because we're sending these letters to many, many voters, and because y'all are so helpful in helping us send these letters to many, many voters, that real world impact can be really large. So when you multiply that percentage point turnout impact by the number of voters that get letters, you start to see that thousands of votes are being gained, right? So this is an example from just a smaller experiment where we sent mail to 70,000 voters. But you can imagine, right, in a much larger program like this year where we're sending millions of letters, even if that impact is really small, when you multiply it out, it gets really, really big. So if you're maybe a little statistically savvy, or maybe you're just a skeptic, you're thinking, okay, how do we know that this really was us? How do we know that it wasn't random chance? So there's this idea of statistical significance. You might be familiar with it already, but a sort of easier way to explain it is just to say that it represents how confident we are that an effect is real and it's not just random chance. So basically, like the result that I'm showing you here in this graph is one where we can be very confident just based on the size of that impact and those error bars that the effect probably is real. And I do want to emphasize that even when we don't reach that bar of statistical significance, it doesn't mean necessarily that the campaign didn't have an impact. It just means that we don't know. It means that we're more uncertain. So you can think of this as a way of representing how certain we are. That means that we just data. That's part of why also it's so great to run these large campaigns like in 2020 and 2022, because then we can be really sure about what we're seeing. But other times it means that we need to try something different. And that's also what I think I'm really excited about in the Vote Forward Labs program, because we're always trying those different things. So these are some of the FAQs that I get about this. I'll just go through them, but I know we have some time for questions at the end. So one question I get a lot is, why don't you just send letters to everybody, right? Like, you want everybody to vote, so just send letters to all of them. That makes a lot of sense. But the problem with that is that if we don't leave a few voters out at least, we don't have any baseline for comparison, right? Then we'd say, okay, say 45% of the people in our program voted, but what does that mean? What is that relative to? Is 45% good? Is it bad? Did it go up? Did it go down? We don't know. So there's sort of a trade-off where, yes, we have to actually withhold some letters from some people in order to get that impact estimate, but usually it's worth it. And then another question that I hear sometimes is, I've heard that correlation isn't causation, and we have to be careful about, sort of assuming things based on correlation. So how do we know that this isn't just some correlation, and that there isn't something else that explains these results? And that's where the randomization part of the randomized trial comes in. So when you randomly assign people, we're ensuring that those groups are the same, essentially, statistically more or less identical. So we can be really, really sure that the only factor that's different is vote forward. And then the last thing that I'll mention here is just, I showed you a bunch of different numbers in that first impact slide. And something that I do get asked is, okay, but what is the one number that summarizes the impact of these letters? It's a great question, and I wish I had that number, but unfortunately, every election and every campaign is just so different that we see different things every time. So there isn't just one single number that says, okay, this is the impact of vote forward letters. We found it, we're done, and we can go home. Every time we do this, we see something different. And I think my perspective on it is, we want to measure that complexity. We want to understand, why was this effect bigger in this election versus that election, or in this state versus that state, or with these voters versus those voters? And we're still just at the very beginning of understanding those differences, but that's something I'm really excited about going forward. So moving on, that's the measurement and estimating impact part. But before that, right, we have to find voters to send letters to. And a lot of people ask me questions about this too. So first of all, I'll just remind us, there are two basic types of campaign that you'll see if you go and adopt letters. There are social campaigns. Those are targeted at voters of color. And there are political campaigns that are targeted explicitly at Democratic-leaning voters. And they're regardless of what campaign it is. These are all voters that we think are probably not that likely to vote. They might be, super unlikely to vote. They might be somebody who's sort of on the edge, but they're not that person that shows up for every election, because that person's going to show up no matter what we do. And so we find these people in basically publicly available voter files. I know this is a thing that sometimes surprises people. I was surprised to learn about this. But as a voter, your registration information and whether you vote is public, and that's what allows us to measure turnout. But, and this is a good thing, how you vote is private. So we can't see whether people chose Joe Biden or Donald Trump in 2020, but we can see, did they vote in the 2020 election at all? And so what that means is that we have the data that we need to rigorously measure the actual impact of these turnout campaigns. So that's the TLDR on how we choose voters. Happy to talk more about that as well. But the last thing that I want to touch on here before we move to the Q&A is this question about messaging. And this, again, is just something that we get a ton of questions about. And unfortunately here, we're stepping out of the realm of numbers where I have, more precise answers for you. And we're stepping into the realm of words where everything is very nuanced and extremely difficult to test. So we've started to try to test this, and I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. But it is just very complex. And so I can't tell you exactly, yes, this is the best message you should write in your letters. However, I will share a few tips and tricks, some of it coming from our own research, some of it coming from external research, that are just principles to guide you as you write letters. And then also in the Q&A, I think we can talk more about other messaging stuff. So the first piece of advice that I have for you is just keep your message personal, right? We did an experiment in New Mexico in 2021 where we had folks go through a personal story training before they wrote letters, and we saw some evidence that those letters were more effective. So our experimental evidence suggests this. If you have a background in organizing, if you are somebody that goes and knocks on doors, you know that personal storytelling can often be a very compelling thing for folks. And we have that personal story training on our website. So if you haven't already used that, that's something that you can check out as you're trying to figure out what to write. But I'll also say, we've started doing some surveys with voters. We do some qualitative research, some interviews with them. And that fact that this letter is coming from a real person that hand wrote it, that is the thing that sticks out to them. That is the thing that makes them say, like, wow, like, even if, regardless of what I think about what they wrote, the fact that they cared enough to like handwrite this to me, that really matters. And so I would just encourage you not to forget that, unlike every other piece of political mail, realistically, that these folks are getting, this is really coming from a real person, and it is telling them something that is real and authentic. So lean into that, use that. Don't feel like, oh, I should find the best message tested thing to say that, the Democratic Party approved. Don't worry about that. Just write what is really coming from your own personal experience. That's usually the way to go. One common, I think, pitfall that I see folks fall into is using language that sounds like it's telling people what to think or do. And this is fresh in my mind because I was just watching some recorded interviews with voters who we showed our letters to, and they definitely responded pretty negatively to anything that sounded like, you're telling me what to think. And that's not surprising, right? Like, people don't want you to tell them what to think. And that's true for the people getting the letters. So even subtle stuff like, saying it's a duty to vote, that sort of stuff can imply that you're telling them what's right and that you know what's right for them. And sometimes people don't react well to that. Also, when you tell them that they should vote, or they need to vote, or they must vote, I would steer away from that kind of language and use maybe softer versions of that. So then on the positive side, leaning into the social aspect of letters, I think, is a really fruitful way to go. So this is coming from like a very rich tradition in psychology and in field studies on turnout tactics. This idea of social inclusion, things like priming social norms, social connectedness, that's really a powerful motivator for folks. So I just put some example messages in here, like, if you say millions of us are voting this year, will you join us? That sense of invitation, of belonging, the fact that, we're all doing this together, I think those sorts of messages are very compelling for people. And then in line with the first thing I said about personal storytelling, and Sienna, I know you had a question for me about this too, so I wanted to talk about it. Mentioning like issues or experiences or topics that you feel really strongly about, often, your most authentic and heartfelt message, of course, is going to bring those things up. And that's actually like a good thing. Our experience in the voter research I've seen is that people are really open to hearing that sort of thing, especially if they think it's coming from a real person. People are very open to having conversations, even if the thing that you think isn't necessarily exactly what they think. But I will emphasize, we should be really, really careful not to assume that our readers agree with us, because when we choose these voters, we're not choosing them for their agreement on specific issues. So there's no guarantee that you are writing to somebody who's like super pro-choice, right? There's no guarantee that you're writing to somebody who doesn't own a gun and isn't a Second Amendment type person. So I would just say the two things to think about are like, one, is this a specific policy stance? If it is, I would maybe say, can you turn it into talking about like an experience you've had or a more general issue or a value? And then secondly, if it's like a super hot button issue, and I know, for example, reproductive rights is in the news a lot, I'm not saying that you shouldn't write about that. I'm saying just be aware that the person you're writing to, may not agree with you. And so you should think about, how would this read to somebody who doesn't share my views? And B, they may be hearing a ton of things about that already, right? This might just go into their brain as, okay, you're the 10th person to talk to me about this today. So I would just encourage you to think about those two things. Think about how that's going to land with the person that receives your letter. And of course, this is all coming from the idea that our job here, fundamentally, writing letters, we're trying to motivate people. We're trying to get them excited, trying to get them feeling good about going to vote, trying to feel like their vote makes a difference, really positive about elections. We're not trying to get them to agree with us on every issue. And so I would just encourage you to think, okay, how can I mention this thing that really matters to me, but not in such a way that my focus becomes convincing them that they need to agree with me? How can I make it so that overall my message is still focused on getting them to the polls? And then lastly, I know I just said a bunch of stuff at you, but really don't overthink it. I know people really, really agonize about it, but there really is no perfect message. If you're thinking about the things that I mentioned, if you're, keeping it real, keeping it grounded in your own life and your own thoughts, that's the best that you can do. So yeah, don't worry about it too much. And that's pretty much all I got. I want to open it up. I'll stop screen sharing here. I want to open it up to any questions that y'all may have. And I see that there's stuff in the chat. A question from Wes. Does the impact include all the voters in the household or just the specific person addressed? That's a great question. So typically in our campaigns, we do not exclude voters who are in the same household. So if there are, for example, say 2 Democratic leaning voters in the same household, we might send mail to both of them. And so our impact is representative of sort of the average impact across the whole program. That being said, most households are not receiving lots of letters. It's usually 2 at most. And we have not seen evidence that there's any spillover there, although there probably is some happening that we can't measure. Any other questions? I'll stop talking for a minute here if you want to drop them in the chat or just raise your hand.
I have a question. I get really nervous. I did this in the 2022 about the mail date, especially last year with hearing about stuff going on in the post, the post office and everything, about making sure that voters will actually receive their vote forward letters before, especially when I'm waiting to send, hundreds and hundreds of letters. And this year it'll be thousands because we have this nice, great group that's working so hard on them. How do you guys come up with that date? Do you account for things like, delays in mail and things like that? Because I do get really nervous. Like we do all this work and people don't get these letters before the election.
Great question. So yes, we do take a ton of that into account. We do monitor USPS delivery, and we do try and be as responsive as we can. So in 2020, for example, we did move that mail date because we were seeing that evidence come in that stuff was not arriving on time. We also use, I guess, like at this point, we've done so many campaigns and they've had different mail dates. So we do have some evidence about like, okay, when did letters tend to land in those ones? And I think the good news is that the kinds of disruptions that we saw in 2020, we're not seeing this year. So we're not seeing those like extended delivery times. We're definitely, seeing things mostly return to normal. There are always little kind of patches where things can get bogged down. But as a general rule of thumb, we would say that 1 week out, 7 days out is the absolute latest we would send letters. So what you're seeing here this year, the 10-day from mail date to election day, that's the 7 days plus a little bit of buffer time. So we basically made that choice to try and get as close to election day as possible, which we also believe based on past research is going to be the most effective if it's hitting people right before they have the chance to act, before they forget about it or lose it on their dining room table or whatever, right? So we're still getting them right at the moment where it matters, but we're also giving ourselves that buffer room. I'm seeing a good question from Catherine about sample size for the controlled studies. So yeah, what's interesting about most of our campaigns is that they're not actually samples. They're often populations. So we'll say something like, we want to send this letter to all of the voters in this particular district before this election who meet certain targeting criteria. And our sample is essentially all of them minus the control group. Now, in terms of like how large that typically is, it really depends on the election. So the smallest campaigns that we do, right, would be at the level of a congressional district. That would be, on the level of tens of thousands of voters. But what you'll see at the state level is like hundreds of thousands of voters. And then moving up to this year and in 2020, we're talking about millions of voters distributed across states. So yeah, I don't think we've ever done anything that was smaller than like 10,000 voters per condition. And I usually wouldn't, because at that level, it becomes very difficult to detect effects. Follow on from Wes, how do you address the letters? Use first name, surname, or no name? In terms of, Wes, do you mean the name that you write on the letter, or the address that you write on the outside of the envelope? On the letter itself. I think our standard practice is just first name. But I think it's also really up to you if you want to be a little bit more formal. I don't think that's a bad thing either.
Not just voter. You have to use their actual name, like dear Joe, Mary, something like that.
Yeah, we recommend that you do use their real name, because people respond to seeing their name. It feels more personal.
Okay. Yep. Thanks.
Yeah, happy to answer that. And thanks for your good questions. Carol has a good question here. How do you compare letters and postcards in terms of effectiveness? This is also one that I get a lot. And I wish that there was some sort of head-to-head experiment where I could tell you exactly how each of them stacked up. Unfortunately, there is not. Here's what I can tell you. In general, in terms of the overall impact of the tactic, what I typically see is that the impacts for letters, and I'm looking here at the research base of evidence over time, right? Not any one individual election, but looking at the pattern of results. It looks like letters are a little bit more effective just based on what I've seen in the literature. But I know that postcards are often a little bit cheaper and quicker for folks to write. So often what we'll say, like, I think the thing that is fair to say is that one postcard versus one letter, the letter is probably going to be a little bit more effective, but that postcard is probably going to be maybe a little bit quicker for you to write. So at that point, it's sort of up to you about, okay, if you're somebody that doesn't have a lot of time, maybe the postcards make sense. But if you're just looking for the tactic that you think has the most kind of impact per letter, the letters are going to be more effective. And again, we think that postcarding programs are great, actually. Like, I think it's great that people are being involved. They're trying different things. I think it only helps our movement. I'm just trying to represent what I've been seeing in the evidence.
Does anybody else have any questions? I think I've got my script memorized, what I'm writing. I think I've probably written a couple hundred. I know Elise has written a ton. We've had a lot of people working so hard on our letters. And it's really great, Emily, that you joined us, because I think I get asked a lot of the questions that you've received, and I've looked on the website to try to help answer them. And I just love hearing it from you directly and how you guys actually analyzed all of this. So thank you so much for joining us today. This was really great to have you.
No, thank you so much for having me. I know that my internet might be breaking up, so you might not hear me super well. But again, thank you so much. It's really just a pleasure always. I get such like warm, fuzzy feelings from talking to people who are doing this work on the ground. So thank you so much. And I'm actually just seeing what I was able to see in the slides before I came on. I'm just super blown away by everything you're doing. Like, the letters are such a tiny, tiny part of all the efforts that you're putting in. And I'm just amazed. So thank you for doing all that you do. It's amazing.
Yeah, we have a great team over here. We really do. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. That concludes our meeting. And I'm actually really glad Emily reminded me about recording it. So I get confused on the technical stuff and always forget. So I'm going to share this with our group in our newsletter so everyone can hear the great information. So thank you all for joining us here today. And I hope to see you at some of our events this weekend. We have a lot.
Thank you, Sienna.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.